Hello, creeps. Welcome back to the mortuary. I am your host, Morbid Tuna, and this is where we talk about horror films and related geekery. On this episode of the mortuary, I am going to be reviewing 2024's Terrifier 3. This is, obviously, the third installment in the Terrifier franchise, which began just a few years ago with director and writer Damien Leone as he introduced us to Art the Clown, the latest slasher carrying on the tradition of the great slashers of the 1980s and 1990s. So, as I've just said, Terrifier 3 is a slasher film. And, as implied by the number 3, it's also a sequel. And that means that it needs to succeed in two areas. It needs to succeed as a horror film and as a sequel. Now you might be wondering why these criteria would matter. Why does a film that is a sequel have to work in one sense and a film that's a slasher has to work in another sense? Why is this important? Because of the dual nature of a slasher film and a sequel, it has different criteria to make it good in different ways. Some films that are slasher sequels succeed as one, but not the other. For example, A Nightmare on Elm Street 2: Freddy's Revenge. Great horror film, not a very good sequel. Why? Well, let's get into what makes a great horror, specifically, what makes a great slasher film. For a good slasher, you need a simple plot. Slashers are simple. There is some guy, some girl, some thing running around murdering people. That's what a slasher is in the simplest terms. That is the villain. Or sometimes villains, plural. Sometimes it's the lone villain, such as Freddy Krueger. Or sometimes it's a whole gang of villains, such as the Sawyer family in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. But in any case, the villain or villains have to be memorable. All the most famous slashers have something that is their trademark. There's a visual trademark, there's their MO, whether it's Jason Voorhees with his hockey mask, whether it's Freddy Krueger with his metal-bladed glove and stripy sweater, whether it's Leatherface with his chainsaw and skin mask. There has to be at least one thing that stands out to make them memorable. Also, to make them memorable in how they go about their killings. Are they a silent stalker? Are they some kind of a mess-with-your-head type stalker? Do they come out of the darkness for a quick kill? Do they torment you for a long time? Do they seem harmless and friendly at first and then turn on you? All these things can be part of any slasher's MO. The Terrifier films definitely have a very, very memorable villain, Art the Clown. Art is an interesting character. Damien Leone is obviously very, very heavily influenced by the classic slashers, particularly of the 1980s. This is apparent in the color palette of the film, the score of the film being very synth and 80s sounding, and also in the way Art the Clown is presented. He is silent, but also very expressive, which to me is like a melding of the two most famous slashers of all time, Jason Voorhees and Freddy Krueger. Jason, as we all know, is silent, never utters a word. Freddy Krueger is known for his one-liners. So while Art is silent, he is very physically expressive. His face is very expressive. He does lots of gestures. He does those miming gestures that you will see professional clowns do with the exaggerated facial expressions and the silent laughing and all that body language stuff where he talks without actually using any words. So in that way, he's kind of a combination of those two, not to mention Freddy's warped sense of humor as well. Art tends to put some dark, ironic humor into a good many of his kills. Another thing that a good slasher needs is a hero or heroes that you can root for. Of course, not just because the villain is so horrible that you want to see them be defeated, but the hero themselves has to be cool or admirable in some way. In this case, the main hero is Sienna Shaw, and the sort of secondary hero is her younger brother, Jonathan. Sienna, though, is definitely the main hero, and you really can root for her. She is obviously very pure of heart, very morally upstanding. She is brave, she is resourceful, So she is a hero you can definitely root for. On top of all that, I mean, here's Art the Clown, hideous. And here's Sienna, the exact opposite. They're opposites in a lot of ways, but we'll get to that later. The point is, Terrifier 3 does have both a memorable villain and heroes that you can root for and get behind. Also, slashers need victims, at least some victims, that you feel sorry for, that you care about, at least a bit. It makes you want all the more for the villain to finally be defeated. Terrifier 3 definitely accomplishes this because even with victims that you only really get to know for 5 or 10 minutes before they meet their doom, the dialogue is written in such a way that it isn't corny at all. It makes them just seem like ordinary people. People you might go to school with, people you might work with, your friends, your neighbors. They seem like real people. And then when Art ends up inevitably torturing them to death, put it this way, if you haven't seen any of the Terrifier movies, but you've seen the Hellraiser movies, Art makes the Cenobites from Hellraiser look gentle and merciful. So yeah, you really feel sorry for these victims. Another thing that good slasher films have is some stalking. There has to be a bit of the savoring of the kill, a little bit of the villain watching you from across the street or through a window or looking around the corner or something. Art doesn't do a lot of that, but he does it sometimes, and it does build even more of the tension for the audience. It doesn't necessarily creep the characters out, but it creeps the audience out. One other thing that a good slasher film has to have is fun kills. Inventive kills. This was all kicked off by the great slashers of the past, the ones I mentioned earlier. There is some very dark and ironic humor involved in some of Art's kills. They're always absolutely brutal. The joy that he gets out of these ridiculous, like stomach-churning kills. I've seen a lot of gross stuff in horror movies. I've seen a lot of graphic violence in horror films, but holy crap, there's some of this stuff for the first time I watched it, even some things that have been spoiled that I knew were going to happen. I thought, okay, it can't be as graphic and as bad as I think it's going to be, and it always was. A big part of that is that Damien Leone refuses to take the easy route and CGI his gore. All his gore, all the kills are practical effects. Very 1980s again. Fake blood galore, guts, and it's all very visceral, all over the actor's hands and all over the place. Very creative, very imaginative, and really gross. Also, some of the stuff that Art does to people, you can almost imagine what that would feel like. One of his things, by the way, one of his tricks he likes to pull is to ambush somebody and inject them with the sedative. And then they wake up tied to a chair. If you wake up tied to a chair in any movie, it's not good. But if you wake up tied to a chair in a Terrifier movie,
you're about to experience levels of trauma and agony you didn't even know existed.
So, Terrifier 3 does well as a slasher. The next question, does it do well as a sequel? Well, let's have a look. A good sequel has to, first of all, follow the rules established by the previous films. I mentioned Nightmare on Elm Street 2 earlier. As I said, a great horror film, one of my favorites in fact, but it's not a very good sequel. That's why that one gets quite a lot of hate from a lot of fans of the series. It doesn't follow all the conventions set out in the first film. No matter how good of a horror film it is, it's not a good sequel. A sequel should continue the story, and there should be continuity between films, and in that case there isn't. So, does Terrifier 3 have that continuity? Well, let's see. For the actors, it certainly does. You have the same guy playing Art the Clown through all three films, David Howard Thornton. You have the same woman playing Sienna, Lauren Lavera. The actor who plays her younger brother, Jonathan, he's also in both of them. Having that is not essential, but it is a big plus. Also with continuity, you have to make sure that the plot flows properly. The timeline makes sense. And from what I can discern in the Terrifier films, that does happen. Another important thing about continuity in horror sequels is keeping the lore the same. The rules of whatever the villain or monster is that you're dealing with need to be established in the original film, and while they should be expanded upon in a good sequel, the base has to remain the same. Terrifier 3 does respect the basic elements of what we already know and builds on them. Next item for a slasher sequel is the body count. Now, we've all heard that the body count must be higher for a slasher sequel. That's debatable, but I'm gonna have to come down on the side of, yeah, it should at least be equal to, if not maybe a little higher than. I actually did count them all up. Terrifier 3 has a lower body count than Terrifier 2, which had a higher one than the original Terrifier. You might think at first that's a drawback. I would say maybe yes, if you're going just by numbers, but art spares nobody. And I mean nobody. Even little kids are not safe from Art the Clown. And in this one, by my count, there are more kids who die than in the previous films. While the body count is not as high, the shocking immorality of the murders is probably on par, if not more. Something else that a slasher sequel needs to do is to set the bar high right off the bat. As soon as we get into the action of the film, and we're not even 5 minutes into this one, when we see Ard murder an entire family. It doesn't ever fall short in that department. It at least lives up to the standards of gore and mayhem that have been set by the previous two movies. Another important thing with slasher continuity is showing how the main good guy characters have been affected by events from previous films. In the Halloween franchise, when she's there, we see how Laurie Strode was affected by the things that happened to her at the hands of Michael Myers. Tommy Jarvis in the Friday the 13th series, we see him experiencing great deals of PTSD after his encounters with Jason, at least in Friday the 13th Part 5. And Terrifier 3 does show that Sienna and her brother Jonathan, as I mentioned, are very deeply psychologically scarred from the vile things that they witnessed and that happened to them individually. In part of Terrifier 3, Sienna is being released from a mental health facility where she's been locked up for the past 5 years. Interestingly, Art and his demonic companion that we saw a little bit of in the previous film have been completely inactive for those 5 years. They seem to reactivate once Sienna is back out into the world, which is another element of a good horror sequel. The yin-yang, good-evil dichotomy between the villain and the hero. And Sienna, as I said, is shown as being angelic. In fact, as like a counterweight to Art's absolutely atrocious evil. And small side note on continuity as well, Art's appearance is almost exactly the same in all three Terrifier films, with one small, fairly subtle difference, which is his eyes. His eyes do change from the original to the third. Let's just say that that is more evidence to support the fact that he has become more powerful as the films have gone by. The reasons behind that can be debated, but he has sustained more physical damage that he was somehow able to recover from over the course of the films, and as that's happened, the color of his eyes changed. And I think that just shows the evil force that gives him his endurance, his stealth, and his ability to recover from injuries is only becoming more powerful and more present as the films go on. Now, one other thing that slasher films, and horror films in general, I think, which to me makes them good, is that they are thematic. Whether it's subtle or it's very overt, the themes tend to make it more interesting, and there are several themes in Terrifier 3 that I'd like to touch on briefly right now. The dichotomy of the good versus evil, Sienna's angelic or savior persona versus Art's very demonic, infernal one. There's a part in the film where Sienna ends up literally wearing a crown of thorns, which of course is associated with the figure of Jesus Christ in Christianity, referred to as the Savior or Messiah. Now, the word Messiah, though, is a Hebrew word, comes from the Torah, and originally the concept of a Messiah in the Torah is a savior in the sense of a military leader, a warrior, not in the sense of a self-sacrificing, sort of sacrificial lamb who's going to save the whole world. Sienna, though, has qualities of both of those things. As I mentioned, she has this warrior angel look, and at the same time, it's also very clear that she is sacrificing herself to save others and perhaps even the entire world. Connected to the good versus evil theme, we have another very strong theme in the Terrifier films, which is the idea of corruption. That art is like corruption on two legs. He appears dressed like a clown. Clowns are supposed to be funny, they're supposed to entertain children, they're supposed to be something that is associated with the fun and innocence of childhood. Of course, art is none of those things. He's a monster. And in the case of Terrifier 3, because it takes place starting a few days before Christmas and over Christmas, there's the corruption of Christmas itself, something that, again, we associate with fun and with joy and love and good childhood memories. Not something that we want to have besmirched by bloodshed. But that's exactly what Art the Clown does. Another theme in the Terrifier films is the theme of isolation. The feeling like no one is coming to help you. It's you versus the monsters, and that's it. It's all up to you. And that's another way that it's linked also to the 1980s horror films that had the kids versus the monsters thing going on. The idea that nobody believes the kids. The adults can't help. In the original Terrifier, Art the Clown was believed by everyone to be a serial killer, who then committed suicide when the cops cornered him. So most people think Art the Clown was a horrible serial killer, yes, but he's dead. He's dead. It can't be him. He can't be back. That's impossible. The only ones to know the truth, of course, Sienna and Jonathan, are the only ones who can stop him because nobody else believes there is a threat. You see this with Nancy's dad in the original Nightmare on Elm Street, who is a cop but doesn't believe that there can possibly be a killer that's inhabiting people's dreams. They see the Monster Squad as well, and The Lost Boys is another good example. Again, it's the kids versus the monsters. We get that in Terrifier 3, and that makes us root for them even more because we all remember being kids and being convinced that something was hiding under our bed or in our closet, and the adults didn't believe us. So, now I've talked about the themes of Terrifier 3, I've talked about whether it succeeds as a horror film on its own, and whether it succeeds as a sequel. And for the most part, in all these areas, the answer is yes. Would I tell someone to go see it? Yes, but with a big caveat though, this is really one for the gorehounds. And I'm really not exaggerating. Like, I know people who've seen a zillion horror films who aren't able to keep their eyes open through some of the scenes in the Terrifier films. And myself, like I said, I've seen a lot of messed up stuff, but a couple of those scenes I was just sitting there like, holy crap. It's not exaggerated. The hype is true. These movies are crazy on the gore. And I do appreciate some of the dark humor that goes into some of these very imaginative kills. I can't help feeling that it is getting a bit gratuitous at times. Like they're just trying to show, look how gross we can be. And crazy kills have their place. It just feels to me like sometimes it goes on a little bit past the line where I can even believe it anymore. If you get an arm cut off and a leg and half your face ripped off and whatever, you would go into shock. It wouldn't take long before you bled out. Some of it is just so over the top that I'm sitting here going, okay, come on, this person would have been dead like at least 2 minutes ago. Like this is getting silly now. That's the only really bad thing I can say about these films. Generally, I find them very entertaining. The first one was Leon's first foray into the world of Art the Clown as a solo film. The second one built a lot on that. I think that the second one improved on the original. And the third, I think, measures up to the second. Doesn't quite surpass it, but in most respects, it is at least the equal of the second. Overall, in general, good horror film and good sequel, with only the drawbacks that I mentioned just now. Therefore, I'm going to give Terrifier 3 4 dead tunas out of 5. Well, that's all I have to say about this particular Splatterfest. If you like what you see and you like what you hear in my videos, by all means, click that like button, click that subscribe button, and tell your horror-loving friends to come on by the mortuary and listen to Morbid Tuna going on about horror movies. I'll be reviewing another one in a couple of weeks, so make sure you tune in for that. And until then, this is me saying, slash you later.